Hi class, in this video I'm going to go over T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I'm going to talk about some historical context that will help you understand the poem a little bit better, as well as I'm going to talk about part one. I'm going to separate this video into a few sections so that there's not too much in one. So this would be part one. Okay, so let's go to Canvas. So just for reference, definitely check out these Wasteland video materials that I posted. Just as a supplement, this is kind of help you understand the context of the poem. It was written post-World War I, and so World War I plays a huge part in the content of the poem. So this first one's not as important, but it is about like how the war started and why it started. So, but these last two are really important as far as the trauma and the after effects of World War I on society, particularly in Europe, in which this epic poem takes place. So definitely check those out. Also, you want to check out the week 3 class notes that I posted. This is from when I taught in person, but it still applies, and you can feel free to look at this. This really just talks about like all the different sections of the poems and all of the sort of like elements and symbolism that the class found, so definitely feel free to check those out. So The Wasteland is the first epic poem of its kind. It's a very, very long narrative that is in poetic form. There's a rhyme scheme, there is structure to it, but it is a longer poem. It was written in 1922, post World War I, and it really deals with some of the concepts of industrialization, the rise of capitalism, and most importantly, modernity. It also takes place during the age of disillusionment, and this is really about the loss of innocence in society following such a horrific war. And it led to these ideas of existentialism. So these brings about questions of like, what is the point? Is there a God? What is my purpose? Who am I? Very much the same questions that people were asking during the Renaissance, during Shakespeare's time as well. It also leads to this idea of nihilism, like bitterness, the feeling that nothing matters, as well as the belief that life has no meaning. So this all came out of the age of disillusionment, post-World War I. And World War I really set the tone for all modern wars. It was the first war was like really man versus machine. There was technology, there was machinery, armory, gunpowder on a scale that no one had ever seen before. And many, many young people died. Entire generations of men between the ages of 18 and 25 just gone. Whole villages gone. And so this really traumatized society. I mean, people thought they were being punished by God during this time. And not just that, but disease was spreading, the great influenza, and so you had people dying not just of warfare but of sickness because of just there's not modern medicine. There wasn't a bunch of knowledge about like cleanliness, and these men are like sitting in these trenches getting sick, exchanging diseases. There's rats. I mean, it was just horrible. So a lot of people died, and it was really traumatic for society as a whole. And so again, these ideas of modernity are really post-World War I, this like these existential questions, these questions of life and God and purpose really came about. You'll also notice that in the videos, if you watch them, there's talk of poppies being planted, flowers being planted to like commemorate people who had died during that period of time. They grew on the battlefields, blooming from dead soldiers' bodies. And this plays a huge role in the poem itself. So let's go ahead and get to the poem. So you may want to like copy and paste it into Word docs so that you can annotate it like I did. So the first part that I'm going to go over is the burial of the dead, which of course is, about the beginning of the end. So the end of World War I, dealing with the carnage, dealing with the dead soldiers and the dead people. And it starts out with one of the most famous lines, April is the cruelest month. So this is a paradox, right? April we think of as actually a time of warmth and rebirth, not cruelty. But in this case, when you're talking about flowers blooming from corpses, like it's a reminder of the dead. So for a lot of people, it was a traumatizing time, right? Also, like this kind of dull roots with spring rain. It's like the mixing of memories of death and carnage coming to new life. Like people want to forget and they just can't. Like there's this constant reminder. And in a way, it's ironic, right? That you've got these fields where there's these beautiful flowers and underneath them is all this carnage and death. Like there's something about that that's very horrifying and yet ironic. Winter kept us warm, covering. Again, this is a paradox. Winter isn't warm. And who is it covering? Is it covering people or is it covering the dead? I don't know. It's an interesting question to think about. And again, just like this repetition of wanting to forget the trauma, wanting to forget the dead, remembering of better times. And you'll notice there's a lot of German in the poem. You can go ahead and Google these terms. They'll come up pretty quickly. You're not missing too much, but if you feel like you want to, you can. You'll also notice that throughout the poems, there's going to be a lot of references to Germans in general, because World War I hit the Germans very hard. Like, they really suffered economically. It was basically their war that they lost. And as you know, the outrise from that was the rise of fascism, the kind of condemnation of the Jews. And so a lot of this is mentioned in this poem sort of subtly, if you really pay attention. And then there's talk of Son of Man, right? Jesus is brought up a lot. God is brought up a lot in this poem. You can just like look out for it. And the dead trees give no shelter, the crickets no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. So there's no relief from grief or death. There's no water. The land is infertile. Like, this is a repetitive kind of image that's brought up in the poem. I'll show you fear and a handful of dust. Dust is always there to greet you. It's looming, right? Is essentially what this part of the poem is saying. And then there's this part in German, which is basically about remembering a young man who died in the war. And again, just remembering the dead. It goes from wanting to forget to wanting to remember, right? It goes back and forth. And then living nor dead, I knew nothing. Like, something about the Walking Dead, right? The people that are alive are not really alive. And a lot of people felt like this at this time. And then this line here means desolate and void, the sea. So there was this fear of the ocean, and the ocean was a mysterious place that people thought would just swallow you up, kind of like the woods were kind of mysterious back in the day. Like, people didn't know what was in there. They thought something in there was tempting and sinful. Same thing with the ocean. It was mysterious. It was cruel. And then there's this talk of a clairvoyant, right? The psychic, who references sickness, references the ocean, a drowned sailor, and also admits that I cannot find the hangman. She cannot see the future. There's nothingness in the future, essentially, right? So there's something about the future that's foreboding, that isn't accessible. And then I see crowds of people walking around in a ring, right? Just imagine, when you read a lot of these lines, you have to kind of imagine it in your head. It's just people walking aimlessly in circles, right? The Walking Dead, again, like a reminder, almost like a post-apocalyptic society, really, is what T.S. Eliot's talking about here. Then there's the talk of the unreal city, which is London, which I think is maybe referenced as a purgatory, like some sort of a in-between, right? Not quite heaven, not quite hell. Condemned in the in-between, that's sort of like hanging. And then a crowd flowed over London Bridge. This is weird, right? Because water flows under, but people don't really flow over it. So there's like a conflict here, something that's kind of a tension, right? It's a language of drowning, but not really saying it's drowning. And then also, like, I had not thought death had undone so many. This like sacrifice that was given, people at this time thought, again, they were being punished for something. They didn't know what, but they thought they were being punished. And so people thought, well, maybe all this death was a sacrifice to some god. And then I love this line, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. So this could be looking at the ground, or it could be like laying in a grave looking at your own feet. There's a few different ways you can really interpret that. And then again, this flowing up, this kind of language of water, of drowning, repeated throughout this poem. And then with the dead sound on the final stroke of 9, this is a paradox. So 9 is a divine number. It's considered, wholeness. But in this case, it's in reference to death, like a call of the dead. So there's something about it that's finite. I just think it's really interesting that that's there. And then there's, at the bottom, there's talk about this corpse that is planted in a garden. And something about that is very ironic, right? This repetition of this image of corpses being buried, right? With this hope that they'll birth new life, which of course it doesn't, right? There's something about it that's really horrifying. And again, it's kind of like a repetition that's going on. And again, this mention of, I don't want the dog to dig it up. Like, I don't want this memory and this trauma dug up. I want it to be buried and gone. Right. So when you are citing this poem, I know it's super long. What I would do is break it up into sections. So you could number, the lines in each section, because it'll be so long if you just continue to do it and do it by section. So if you're going to cite the first line of this poem, I would say section 1, line 1, or section 1, line 10, or whatever it is that you're going to cite. So that's how I would change your citing for when you're doing a poem this long. Okay. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and do some other videos for the other sections to help you guys out. Okay.